January 1943. Dawn crept slowly over the Solomon Sea, turning the humid sky into a pale band of silver. On the coral runway below, a line of P-38 Lightnings waited in the half-light, twin booms glistening with condensation, engines ticking as ground crews finished their last checks. The air smelled of fuel, salt, and the faint metallic bite of spent gun barrels from the previous day. Pilots moved with quiet precision. No chatter, no unnecessary movement, only the distant rumble of surf and the rising whine of cyclones warming to life. These men had slept in damp tents, eaten cold rations, and walked through mud that never seemed to dry. But at this hour, their world narrowed to one thing: the sky that would soon try to kill them. Far to the north, over those same waters, Japanese scouts were already climbing. Radio operators at Rabaul believed American fighters were stretched thin, still recovering from earlier clashes. They expected another easy morning, another chance for the Zero to dominate the air. But the men standing beside these P-38s knew something the Japanese did not. They were going back up, and the next 48 hours would change everything. In the early months of 1943, the air war over the Solomon Islands reached a level of exhaustion few theaters of the Second World War could match. The struggle for Guadalcanal had dragged on for half a year. 6 relentless months of ambushes, naval shelling, starvation, disease, and a sky that shifted ownership by the hour. Whoever held the air controlled the sea lanes, and whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the island. At the start, the Japanese had every advantage. Their A6M0 had carved through Allied fighters from China to the Philippines, from Malaya to the Coral Sea. American and Australian pilots had learned the hard way that the Zero could outturn anything they put up. It was light, nimble, climbed like a homesick angel, and punished any pilot who tried to fight it on its own terms. Early 1942 was full of disasters, and Japanese aviators, experienced, well-trained, and flush with victory, fought with a confidence that bordered on certainty. But the war was changing. By late 1942, a new machine had finally arrived in the Pacific. It looked strange compared to the sleek, single-engine fighters of the day: twin engines, twin booms, a central pod where the pilot sat. It was big, powerful, and unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. In the European theater, it was respected. In the Pacific, it was needed. This arrival came not as a symbol, but as a solution. The distances were enormous. Hundreds of miles of open ocean between airfields, patrol zones, and enemy bases. P-39s and P-40s lacked the range. Even the vaunted F-4F Wildcats of the Navy struggled at times to reach the altitude and endurance needed to challenge Zero formations coming from Rabaul. The P-38, however, could patrol for hours, fly across the Solomon chain, and still have the fuel to fight. The Japanese noticed it quickly. It didn't behave like the fighters they were used to. It didn't swirl in tight loops or bleed speed in sharp turns. Instead, it dove hard. Its pilots attacked in fast, clean strikes, then climbed back into the clouds before the Zero could begin its turn. At first, Japanese commanders dismissed it. A twin-engine fighter, they believed, could not possibly dogfight. They would soon learn that the P-38 didn't need to. But before these tactics matured, before the P-38's reputation solidified, before American pilots gained the confidence to meet the Zero head-on, there was a brutal period of adaptation. Early Lightning squadrons fought from makeshift airstrips. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Dobadura in New Guinea, Fighter II on the northern edge of the island. Mud was constant. Malaria was constant. The oppressive heat never relented. Maintenance crews worked through rain, darkness, and bombardments to keep the planes in the air. In these conditions, precision mattered. Pilots' endurance mattered. And the ability to fight at altitude, long before Japanese formations could descend on friendly ships or positions, mattered more than anything. By January 1943, American intelligence had begun detecting a pattern. Japanese reconnaissance flights from Rabaul were increasing. Convoys supplying their garrisons in New Georgia and Bougainville were moving under heavier air escort. The Japanese were shifting from desperation to counterattack. They wanted Guadalcanal back, or, at the very least, they wanted to bleed the Americans enough to slow them. For this, they relied on air power. And for air power, they relied on the Zero. The coming weeks would pit some of the best Japanese aviators, many of them battle-hardened veterans of China and Pearl Harbor, against a new breed of American fighter pilot. Many of these Americans had learned to fly only a year earlier. Some were barely out of high school. Yet they had something the Japanese did not, a machine that could change the pace of the fight. A machine built for the wide, empty distances of the Pacific. A machine that, in the hands of the right squadron, could overturn a year of Japanese dominance in a matter of hours. And as those January days unfolded, the stage was set for a confrontation neither side could afford to lose, one that would test not just aircraft performance, but the endurance, adaptability, and resolve of the pilots who flew them. The tension in the air grew heavier with every reconnaissance report. The squadron at the center of these coming days had not earned its reputation overnight. It was forged across months of attrition, losses, and adaptation. Operating from rough, hastily carved airstrips, they learned the P-38 not in classrooms or training manuals, but in the unforgiving pressure of combat. Every sortie revealed something new: how much throttle the engines could take before overheating, how the turbo superchargers behaved in the tropical humidity, how the Lightning responded when pushed into steep dives through turbulent Pacific clouds. Their commanders were men who understood the stakes. These were not glory chasers or newcomers searching for their first victory. They were pilots responsible for keeping entire islands supplied, for protecting ships vulnerable to Japanese bombers, and for preventing the Zero from regaining the dominance it once held. They drilled their men relentlessly: formation climbing, slashing attacks, radio discipline, and energy management. They wanted pilots who could think at 20,000 feet, not merely react. The squadron's strength lay not in individual heroics but in cooperation. Each P-38 carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. This meant devastating accuracy in brief firing windows. But the true weapon was the squadron's ability to hit in coordinated waves. 6, 8, sometimes 12 Lightnings diving together at precisely the moment Japanese pilots expected a turning fight. By late January 1943, intelligence officers had intercepted enough signals from Rabaul to confirm a major Japanese effort was coming. Large formations had been spotted assembling along the Gazelle Peninsula. Fuel dumps were being filled. Maintenance shops were working through the night. Something big was forming north of the Solomons. The Americans assumed it would be another series of heavy bombing raids, possibly at Henderson Field, possibly at transports near Tulagi, or perhaps at the newly expanding airfields further up the chain. Yet one detail stood out. Japanese reconnaissance planes were probing deeper than usual, sweeping the sea lanes with increasing pattern regularity. When scouts increased their reach, fighters usually followed. The squadron prepared accordingly. Pilots studied maps of expected Zero approach routes. They memorized distances over the open ocean, how long a Lightning could stay on external tanks, how quickly it could climb if combat erupted early, and how far they could afford to chase a Japanese formation before fuel became a threat. The Pacific punished miscalculations with water, not land. Many downed pilots were never found. Japanese planning during this period remained aggressive and confident. The A6M0 had built its legend on outmaneuvering every American fighter thrown against it. Japanese squadron leaders believed they could still dictate the terms of air combat. Rise above the enemy, force a turning engagement, exploit their aircraft's lightweight responsiveness. They had done it dozens of times before. What they did not fully grasp was that the P-38 had changed the rules. The Zero's light frame, the very thing that made it maneuverable, made it fragile. Its unarmored fuel tanks ignited under concentrated fire. Its lack of a robust diving structure meant it could not safely follow a Lightning into a steep descent. And its slower roll rate at high speeds left it vulnerable when American pilots refused to play the turning game. But Japanese commanders, having fought through years of victories, underestimated how drastically the Americans had improved. They believed their pilots could still overwhelm the newcomers through formation discipline and experience. Many had fought in China, in the Dutch East Indies, and over the Coral Sea. They had reason to trust their tactics. The airfields at Henderson and Fighter 2 buzzed with tension as the reports grew sharper. The Americans were no longer waiting for vague rumors. They had confirmation. A sizable Japanese fighter group, accompanied by bombers or scouting elements, would likely appear within days. And if the timing matched earlier patterns, the encounter would erupt quickly, without room for hesitation. Mechanics triple-checked ammunition feeds. Armorers loaded belts meticulously, ensuring not a single round would jam. Pilots inspected oxygen systems, knowing the fight might climb above 22,000 feet. Squadron leaders briefed and rebriefed formations. Who would take altitude, who would dive first, who would stay high to cover the climb out. When the sun rose on January's final days, both sides were already in motion. The Japanese, confident in their Zero's legacy. The Americans, determined to rewrite it. All that remained was for the two forces to meet, and in that meeting, a Lightning Squadron would deliver a shock the Japanese Air Command did not expect. In the Pacific, where days bled into endless weeks, the human cost of war was never more apparent than in the minds of the pilots. These men knew the odds. They had felt the weight of every sleepless night spent hunched in damp tents, hoping malaria wouldn't strike them next. They knew the ground below them wasn't safe, that a bomb could rip through the makeshift runway at any moment, making them just another casualty of geography. By January 1943, the squadron was operating under a level of fatigue that wore men down long before the enemy could. After weeks of relentless combat patrols, brief airstrikes, and skywatch duty, pilots were at their limits. They hadn't just been flying for days. They had been flying through a brutal rhythm of short bursts of battle followed by deep, wrenching moments of uncertainty. But amid the exhaustion, there was something else. A deep, unshakable resolve. They had survived Guadalcanal's impossible conditions. They had watched friends fall, seen comrades burn in the sky, and still, they climbed into the cockpit each morning. Their engines roaring, rising into the suffocating heat and humidity, praying they'd make it back to the airstrip. In the face of overwhelming odds, they still had faith in the machine beneath them. It wasn't just the P-38 that drove them forward, it was the sense of duty, the unspoken promise that they were the last line of defense against the Japanese war machine. The resolve wasn't in the form of heroism or bravado. It was simply the quiet certainty that each man was doing his part. And deep down they all knew, the next flight could be their last. The Japanese Zero had dominated the Pacific for more than a year, and its tactics had proven incredibly effective in the hands of skilled pilots. But the P-38 Lightning was designed with one thing in mind: flexibility. While the Zero excelled in tight turns and dogfights, the P-38's strength lay in its ability to dictate the terms of engagement. The Lightnings were designed to go fast and hit hard. Their twin engines offered power, reliability, and altitude, qualities that made them formidable against any single-engine fighter, especially the Zero. With a top speed nearing 400 miles per hour, the Lightning could dive into a fight, deliver a punishing burst of fire, and climb back into the sky before the Zero could even begin to respond. The tactics were simple. When the Japanese came into range, the P-38s would hit fast, using their superior speed to make quick, deadly passes. They would strike and immediately gain altitude, staying out of the Zero's turn radius. It was a tactic known as boom and zoom: hit hard, then climb away to safety. In combat, the P-38s would often fight in pairs or small groups, keeping formation while one Lightning would take the lead in diving down on the enemy. The second aircraft would stay high, ready to cover the climb out if the Zero attempted to chase. The combination of power, altitude, and strategy was a devastating response to the Zero's overconfidence in its dogfighting abilities. But there was another layer of tactical sophistication. The American pilots had learned how to fight together, not as individuals. Early in the war, pilots often tried to outdo each other in combat, attempting risky moves for the glory of a single kill. But in the face of the Zero's skill, they had learned that cooperation was key. The tactical training that had once been haphazard and hurried became systematic. Each pilot played a role in the larger battle, working in coordination with their wingmen, drawing the Japanese pilots into ambushes, and cutting them down in a way that a single Lightning could not. These tactics were still new, still untested in the crucible of a larger, more sustained air battle. But over time, As the Americans honed their formation flying and perfected the art of the boom and zoom, the gap in combat effectiveness between the two fighters began to close. By January 1943, the Japanese command still underestimated the threat posed by American fighters, especially the P-38. Their pilots, many of whom were seasoned veterans, had faced off against older American aircraft like the F-4F Wildcat and the P-40 Warhawk, but the P-38 was something different. The idea that a twin-engine aircraft could hold its own against a nimble single-engine fighter was foreign to the Japanese. The Zero, after all, had proven itself time and again, beating back enemy fighters with superior maneuverability. Japanese air tactics were built around the assumption that they could force a dogfight, a tight, turn-and-burn engagement where their aircraft excelled. The doctrine favored skilled pilots who could outmaneuver opponents in tight circles, banking sharply and capitalizing on the Zero's ability to fly faster and turn harder than almost any enemy fighter. But the P-38 didn't fight like the others. It didn't engage in turns and twists that would give the Zero pilot an advantage. The Lightning's pilots understood that they couldn't fight in the Zero's wheelhouse. Instead, they played to their own strengths: speed, altitude, and firepower. The Japanese, confident in their ability to dominate aerial combat, simply assumed that the Americans would try to engage in the same fashion they had before. They believed that a fighter with two engines would be a slow, lumbering target, easy prey for the maneuverable Zero. What the Japanese didn't understand was that the P-38 was designed to take on the enemy in a way that no other American fighter had before, using its strengths in speed and altitude to bypass the Zero's strengths in maneuverability. The Japanese had no idea that they were about to face an enemy that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. The P-38 Lightning was not simply a fast aircraft. It was a marvel of engineering that combined raw firepower with unprecedented precision. Its design was an answer to the unique demands of the Pacific theater, where long-range escorts, interdiction strikes, and high-altitude operations were critical to success. The twin-engine, twin-boom configuration set it apart from every other fighter in the sky. What truly made the P-38 a game-changer was its versatility. On paper, it was a fighter-bomber capable of strafing ground targets and carrying bombs, but its most important function in this aerial war was as a long-range interceptor. Its two supercharged engines allowed it to climb to altitudes over 20,000 feet, where it could launch ambushes from above the Zero's typical operating altitude. Its turbochargers gave it the ability to remain at these heights for extended periods, a key feature when patrolling the vast expanses of the Pacific. Armed with 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon mounted in the nose, the P-38 could unleash a withering hail of firepower. This was critical in the combat against the Zero, whose lightweight frame made it highly vulnerable to concentrated fire. The Lightning's firepower was not spread across wings but concentrated into the nose, a lethal arrangement that allowed pilots to focus on accuracy, not volume. The Lightning was also designed to be stable in high-speed dives, essential for boom and zoom tactics. While the Zero's light airframe would begin to shake and flutter in a high-speed dive, the P-38 remained composed, allowing American pilots to strike, then escape with an immediate climb back into the safety of the clouds. Its range was another significant advantage. The P-38 could stay on station for hours, covering vast stretches of the Pacific. This was essential in a theater where vast distances separated islands and airfields, and where a dogfight often took place miles from friendly territory. In combat, these technological advantages became immediately apparent. During the two-day engagement, the P-38s quickly realized they could outclimb and outrun the Zeros. The Japanese fighters, while excellent in close combat, were no match for the Lightning in terms of sheer firepower, speed, and endurance. The outcome of these dogfights was often determined not by who could turn faster, but by who could outlast the other, something that the P-38, with its superior technology, excelled at. Behind every successful military operation lies leadership, the ability to inspire and direct men, especially in the midst of uncertainty and chaos. The pilots of the squadron knew the stakes of every flight, and it was their commanders who ensured they remained focused and disciplined. The squadron's leadership was a crucial factor in its success. Squadron commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Tommy M. McGuire, one of the most decorated pilots of the Pacific, understood the importance of coordination. Their tactics were not simply the result of individual brilliance, but of meticulous planning and an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of both their aircraft and their enemy. Maguire, along with other senior officers, instilled a sense of unity and purpose within the squadron. The key to their success was coordination, flying in tight formations, executing precise timing, and being able to predict the movements of their enemies. Commanders had drilled their pilots into using radio discipline, keeping their formations tight during dives, and, most importantly, knowing when to disengage. Unlike the early days of the Pacific War, when American fighters engaged in chaotic dogfights, these pilots now understood the importance of flying as a unit. Every pilot had a role to play. Some kept high and protected the squadron's altitude, while others dove down to engage the Japanese in brief but decisive bursts. They operated like a well-oiled machine, and this was a key part of their success. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were often forced into tactical improvisation. Many Japanese commanders believed that combat should be fought with individual brilliance. This was why the Zero had been so successful in the early months of the war, with skilled pilots able to turn the tide of battle through their maneuvering. However, the P-38's superior technology and the careful, disciplined tactics of American pilots threw a wrench into this mindset. The Lightning could dominate not because of a single ace pilot, but because of coordinated, disciplined teamwork, built on strong leadership. The air battle that unfolded during the two-day engagement was not just a clash of aircraft, but of tactics and leadership styles. The Americans, under their experienced commanders, had evolved into a formidable fighting force, one that was no longer just surviving in the Pacific. They were beginning to dominate it. The psychological toll of war is often a silent but decisive factor in the outcome of any conflict. For the American pilots, the early days of combat were filled with uncertainty and fear. They had seen the loss of comrades, had felt the sting of defeat, and knew that their survival was never guaranteed. But by January 1943, something had changed. The American pilots were no longer just trying to survive. They were beginning to believe they could win. The Japanese, on the other hand, still operated under the assumption that they would dominate the skies of the Pacific. The Zero had earned its place as the most feared fighter in the world. For Japanese pilots, there was little doubt that their training, discipline, and experience would ultimately lead to victory. However, when the P-38 squadron scored its first major victories, shooting down Japanese aircraft with remarkable precision, it had an immediate psychological impact. The shock wasn't just in the number of kills. It was in the unexpected nature of the attack. The Japanese command had assumed that the Americans would be easy prey. After all, they had been unable to match the Zero in dogfights for so long. The Japanese pilots who survived the initial skirmishes were left shaken. Many of them had never encountered such an aggressive, coordinated American response. The overwhelming effectiveness of the P-38s forced a shift in Japanese strategy, creating a moment of doubt. This moment would reverberate throughout the Pacific War, sending a psychological signal that the American forces were no longer the underdogs. They were beginning to dominate the skies. The psychological impact on the American pilots, meanwhile, was equally profound. After months of hard fighting, they finally had proof that they could beat the Japanese at their own game. The fear of the Zero that had once been so palpable began to dissipate, replaced by a growing confidence. For the first time, they truly believed they could win. The morning of January 23, 1943, broke with the kind of anticipation that always precedes a storm. The sky was clear, the winds gentle, and the sun rose like it had every other day in the Pacific. But for the pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron, this was not just another day in the endless grind of war. It was a moment of fate. The mission had been briefed the night before. A routine patrol along the shipping lanes, but with intelligence reports suggesting an increased Japanese air presence. The squadron's leadership had prepared their men for everything, but nothing could fully prepare them for what lay ahead. It began with a routine sighting. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, perhaps too confident in its altitude, appeared like a silhouette against the pale sky. Then, a second, and a third. Within moments, the unmistakable formations of Zero fighters and bombers filled the horizon. The Japanese had come to challenge the Americans, and they had come in force. For the American pilots, this was no longer just a routine engagement. This was the fight that would define the squadron's reputation. And the stakes were higher than they knew. The Japanese would stop at nothing to reclaim control of the skies over the Solomons. If they succeeded, it would be a blow to the Allies' strategic hold on the Pacific. As the P-38 pilots powered their engines, taxied across the muddy airstrip at Henderson Field, and took off into the still air, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. The familiar rhythm of routine gave way to the sharp focus that only battle could bring. Each pilot knew their role. Each knew the risks. The sky was vast, and the distance between life and death was measured in seconds. At 18,000 feet, the first reports crackled across the radio. Japanese bombers, escorted by a dozen or more Zeros, had entered the area. The battle was set. The squadron's formation split into two groups. Some pilots would climb higher to meet the enemy at altitude. Others would dive first to disrupt the Japanese plane's formation. For the next few minutes, it was a game of patience and timing. Who would act first, and who would wait for the perfect moment? The P-38 pilots knew that if they rushed in too soon, they would risk overwhelming the advantages their aircraft offered. They waited, they watched, and then the signal came. In a sudden flash of motion, the squadron broke apart, with 6 P-38s diving in a tight formation, while the remaining pilots held their altitude, keeping the Zeros in sight from above. The first burst of fire erupted from the nose-mounted guns, and the Zero pilots found themselves under a firestorm they couldn't have anticipated. The lightning struck like a hammer from the sky, cutting through Japanese formations with brutal precision. The initial wave of attacks stunned the Japanese. The P-38s didn't engage in the close-range dogfights that the Zero pilots were accustomed to. Instead, they dived down, struck hard, and then peeled away, climbing back into the safety of the sky. The Japanese pilots, caught off guard by the lightning's speed and firepower, scrambled to respond. But by the time they recovered, another squadron member had already swept down upon them, repeating the cycle. One by one, the Zeros began to fall. A pair of them spiraled out of control, smoke trailing behind them. A third, hit by concentrated fire, exploded in mid-air, fragments raining down toward the Pacific below. The American pilots were relentless. Every pass, every strike, every pull-up was met with a level of precision that had never been seen in the Pacific before. The P-38 pilots had learned to harness their aircraft's unique advantages, its firepower, its speed, its range, to their fullest potential. And now, in these early minutes of battle, it was clear that the tide of the war was shifting. By the time the initial wave of the Japanese formation had been broken, the P-38 pilots had already begun to regroup. They were still high, still above the Zeros, still in control of the fight. But the battle was far from over. The Japanese, though shaken, were far from defeated. As the first engagement ended, reinforcements arrived from Rabaul, their sleek aircraft streaking through the clouds. The Zeros, having lost several of their best pilots in the opening barrage, attempted to regroup and counterattack. For a moment, there was a lull. The sky was clear again, but the battle was only beginning. The P-38 pilots, their engines roaring with fresh fuel, prepared to dive once more. From above, they saw the Zeros line up for another attempt at intercepting them. The next few minutes would be a relentless test of endurance, courage, and skill. This time, the Japanese pilots would have no room for error. They would either push forward in a desperate assault or retreat back to Rabaul, defeated and disillusioned. What followed in the second wave was no less brutal. The Japanese, still underestimating the range and power of the P-38s, tried to engage the American fighters at closer distances. But the Lightning pilots had already proven their superiority in altitude and speed. The fight had turned into a battle of attrition, and the Japanese, whose fuel was limited and whose numbers were thinning, were forced into a corner. They couldn't escape the relentless pressure of the American attack. As the minutes ticked on, the outcome of the fight became inevitable. The Zeros, once thought unbeatable, were being systematically eliminated. It was only a matter of time now before the P-38 pilots would have their final moment of victory. As the second wave of Japanese fighters closed in, their once coordinated formations were now fragmented. Pilots desperate to regroup, yet hindered by confusion and mounting losses. What had begun as a routine patrol for the American squadron had transformed into an all-out assault on the very foundation of the Japanese air superiority in the Pacific. The numbers were on the American side now, but it wasn't just about the numbers, it was the way they fought. The P-38 pilots, having seen the destruction they had already caused, pressed the advantage. The mission had started with no expectations other than a routine patrol. But now, as Zeros rained down around them, the squadron was on the verge of achieving something remarkable. A near-complete disruption of the Japanese offensive, a tactical shift that would resonate across the Pacific. The first to fall was a lead Zero, its pilot unable to break the attack of a P-38 that dove from high above, unleashing a hail of bullets that tore through the aircraft's wings. The Zero broke apart in a fireball, its burning wreckage falling from the sky like a flaming comet. For the American pilots, these were not victories born of luck. They were the result of months of careful preparation. The P-38s were now working as a well-oiled machine, each pilot playing his part in an orchestrated aerial symphony. While the Americans stayed high, their control of the altitude made it impossible for the Japanese to dive in quickly without risking exposure to concentrated fire. They had learned to anticipate the Zero's every move, using their superior speed and climb rate to take the advantage before the Japanese could respond. On the ground, the mechanics, still working tirelessly under harsh conditions, could only watch in silent awe as the sky above them became a battlefield. Their fingers ached from hours of maintenance work on the P-38s. But now, all that mattered was the outcome of this fight. The squadron was proving itself as something more than just a group of fighters. It was the turning point in the battle for air superiority. In the air, the Japanese pilots were reeling. They had believed their Zeros would be able to dominate the skies, just as they had during the first months of the Pacific War. They hadn't counted on the P-38's unexpected ability to outlast them. The fighters, both the American and Japanese, now moved in a deadly ballet above the blue Pacific, each pilot waiting for the right moment to strike. But the Japanese were faltering. Their strikes had failed to land. Their attempts to break the American formations had been foiled by precise, calculated flying. Within an hour of the engagement start, a report crackled over the radio: 14 confirmed kills. The number was staggering, 14 Zeros in a single engagement. The Japanese, still believing their forces could sweep the skies, had been utterly outclassed by the precision and firepower of the P-38 squadron. The damage had been done. The Zero, once seen as the weapon that could turn the tide of the war, had been overwhelmed by an American fighter that could not be easily outmaneuvered. The remaining Japanese forces, sensing the loss of control, attempted to disengage. Some attempted a retreat back to Rabaul, but the American pilots were already on their tails, unwilling to let the Japanese escape. The air was filled with the sound of engines roaring, the staccato pop of machine gun fire, and the sharp, deadly silence that followed each confirmed kill. In the midst of this chaos, the mission's true significance began to settle in. The battle was over, and the squadron had not only proven the effectiveness of the P-38 in the Pacific, but had also delivered a powerful message to the Japanese Air Command. The Zero was no longer the untouchable force it once had been. The Americans had broken the psychological barrier, and with it, the balance of power in the Pacific. By the end of the day, the American squadron had flown through a storm of gunfire and smoke, emerging victorious with 14 confirmed kills, without a single loss of their own. It was a moment of stunning success. A bold statement that American air power, backed by ingenuity, teamwork, and the right technology, could now stand toe-to-toe with the best that Japan had to offer. But victory in the sky had a price. The Japanese Air Command, stunned by the losses, began reassessing its strategies. The Zero was no longer the feared predator of the Pacific skies. The P-38 had demonstrated that there was now a fighter capable of outclassing the Zero at its own game. The effects of this engagement would ripple through the Pacific, altering not just the strategy of air combat, but the very psychology of the Japanese pilots who would now have to reckon with the possibility of defeat. For the pilots of the P-38 squadron, it was the culmination of months of training, sacrifice, and perseverance. It wasn't just a victory in terms of numbers. It was a victory of spirit. The The battle had been fierce, but they had proven themselves not just as survivors, but as leaders in a war that demanded more than just courage. It demanded innovation. The P-38 squadron had struck a decisive blow, and in doing so, they had forever altered the course of the war in the Pacific. The victory of the 39th Fighter Squadron on January 23, 1943, was a seismic shift in the Pacific Air War. The immediate consequences were felt both in the skies above the Solomon Islands and in the strategic rooms of Imperial Japan. 14 Zeros downed in just 2 days was not just a statistic. It was a loss that rippled across the entire Japanese war effort. For the Japanese, the defeat was a wake-up call. The Zero, once the embodiment of invincibility, was no longer the unquestioned master of the Pacific skies. It was a psychological blow to the Japanese pilots who had fought in the Pacific from the very beginning. Their superiority, long taken for granted, was suddenly in question. In the aftermath, the Japanese High Command reevaluated their air strategy in the South Pacific. New tactics would have to be developed, tactics that took into account the powerful American threat now operating in the region. This particular loss, while significant in terms of the number of aircraft destroyed, also exposed a dangerous vulnerability in the Japanese aerial doctrine. The Zero had been successful primarily because it was so effective in close-range dogfights. However, the P-38's ability to dictate the terms of combat through speed, altitude, and concentrated firepower proved to be a counter to everything the Zero relied upon. Japanese pilots would be forced to adapt to a new kind of warfare, one where their advantage in maneuverability was no longer guaranteed. Within the Japanese Imperial Navy and Army Air Force, this was not merely a tactical loss. It was a blow to their perception of American capabilities. In the years prior, they had often underestimated the United States' ability to innovate and adapt quickly to battlefield realities. They had seen the early struggles of the American Air Forces against the Zeros, and they assumed that the Allies would remain outclassed. But the P-38, with its surprising effectiveness, proved otherwise. The American adaptation was no longer just about technology. It was about the way they utilized that technology to reshape the battlefield. For the Allies, the immediate aftermath of the engagement was one of increasing confidence. The P-38 had proven itself as a formidable weapon in the Pacific theater, and its role in shifting the balance of air power could not be overstated. It was no longer just an escort fighter or a bomber interceptor. It was a fighter capable of taking on the best the Japanese had to offer and emerging victorious. The P-38's success in this engagement led to a surge in its use across the Pacific theater. It would soon be employed in even greater numbers for a variety of missions, from fighter-bomber strikes to long-range interdiction missions against Japanese supply lines. Its versatility made it a powerful tool, but it was its role in direct aerial combat, particularly against the Zero, that truly solidified its place in Pacific air history. Meanwhile, the squadron that had achieved this victory became a symbol of resilience and adaptability. The men who flew those P-38s had endured some of the harshest conditions imaginable. They had fought not just against the enemy but against the elements, the terrain, and even their own doubts. The victory was a testament to their training, their leadership, and their unwavering commitment to the mission. And for the rest of the war, that squadron would carry with them the knowledge that they had turned the tide in the Pacific Air Campaign, proving that with the right aircraft, the right tactics, and the right spirit, the Zero could be defeated. On the ground, the American military leadership took note of this victory as well. The P-38's success represented the culmination of years of investment in technology, strategy, and training. It confirmed that the United States had the capability to not only match but surpass the best the Axis powers had to offer in the air. As a result, P-38s would continue to play a central role in subsequent campaigns in the Pacific, particularly in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and later the Philippines and Japan itself. In the following months, American intelligence would continue to monitor Japanese air activity, but now there was a shift. The Zero, once the linchpin of the Japanese air superiority, began to be seen with less reverence. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Zero's dominance had been irrevocably broken. The once feared aircraft would continue to appear in the Pacific theater, but it would never again strike fear into the hearts of Allied pilots as it had in the early years of the war. For the American pilots, The victory of January 23 marked the culmination of a journey that had begun with the bitter lessons of the early Pacific battles. The triumph was not just a testament to the effectiveness of the P-38, but to the enduring spirit of the men who flew it, men who had learned from their mistakes, adapted, and pressed on despite the odds. It was also a turning point for the broader Pacific War. The strategic air campaign in the Pacific had shifted from defense to offense. With the Japanese unable to maintain their air superiority, the United States now had the opportunity to go on the offensive, targeting critical supply lines, airfields, and island bases. The victory of this single squadron, against all odds, would be a key step in the eventual Allied victory in the Pacific. But even as the air war in the Pacific was turning in their favor, the soldiers, sailors, and airmen knew this victory was only part of a larger struggle. Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands were just the beginning. The final push towards Japan would take every last ounce of effort, every last bit of ingenuity and sacrifice. But on January 23, 1943, the 39th Fighter Squadron had shown that, with a relentless will and the right tools, victory was within reach. The battle fought by the P-38 Squadron over the Solomon Islands in January 1943 is often remembered as a single, striking victory in the broader Pacific Air Campaign. But its true significance goes far beyond the number of aircraft downed or the immediate strategic consequences. This engagement marked a turning point in the war, a moment when the balance of air superiority in the Pacific tilted irrevocably in favor of the Allies. For the pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron, this battle was not just about defeating the Zero. It was about proving that, in a war that had been defined by technological innovation and unyielding perseverance, there was always room for the human element, the drive to adapt, to overcome, and to succeed against overwhelming odds. The victory was not the result of luck or a sudden shift in fortune, but of months of hard training, careful strategy, and sheer determination. The P-38 was not just a machine, it was a symbol of the American response to adversity. Its design, unorthodox yet effective, reflected the spirit of innovation that had come to define the United States military during the war. What was seen as a peculiar fighter by some became the key to disrupting Japanese air superiority. The victory was not just technological, it was symbolic. It showed that with the right tools, the right tactics, and the willingness to change the game, even the most entrenched advantages could be overturned. On a broader scale, this victory highlighted the evolving nature of modern warfare. The skies above the Solomon Islands became a proving ground where lessons were learned, mistakes were made, and new strategies were born. But more than that, it showed that the war in the Pacific was no longer just a defensive struggle. The Allied forces had begun to push back, taking the initiative from a Japanese war machine that had once seemed unstoppable. In the end, this battle was a reminder of what humanity is capable of under the most trying circumstances. It was a story of triumph, of men flying against the odds, in machines built for a war that seemed endless. But more than that, it was a reflection of the enduring hope that drives every soldier, every pilot, and every nation in the face of impossible odds. The belief that victory is possible, and that it is worth fighting for.